So Freddie, please take the stage.
Thanks, Matt. Good luck, mate. Thanks, Daniel, for a very kind intro, and thanks also to Plamen and all of the team here. It's great to be in Bulgaria. It's my first time, so thank you very much for the warm welcome. And congratulations as well, because out of maybe 120 countries that are currently trialing CBDCs, Bulgaria is not one of them. So well done, everyone, which is good news. So one question that we might want to get out of the way first: why are we talking about CBDCs at a Bitcoin conference? And we've heard several times during the course of the morning that Bitcoin, like all monies, is of course just a tool. And in juxtaposition to CBDCs, it's a tool that enables you, as much as you can, to preserve your freedom to transact in a way that CBDCs are unlikely to do so. In case anyone's unfamiliar with what they are conceptually, we've stuck up on the slide, they're of course a digital form of money that's issued by central banks. The problem is that they will grant governments a huge level of control over what you do with your money and how you spend it. And I'd like to hark back to something actually that Daniel said in his presentation earlier, if you caught that, about the nature of money in the modern economy. There are really two kinds at the moment. The first is central bank money, and the way that most of us encounter central bank money is in the form of banknotes. And that's a liability of the central bank. You may have seen in various different countries around the world, that's often written on the note itself. I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of $10, £10, €10. The other form of money, which actually forms the majority of money in the modern system, is actually created by commercial banks when they make loans. And that type of money is also a liability, but that's a liability of those commercial banks themselves. So obviously, looking at the first point there, a digital currency, most money actually at the moment is digital. You'll probably notice that over the last few years, there's been a continuous decrease in the use of and the demand for physical cash. And remember, the physical cash is the central bank liability. And actually, while we're on the subject, I'm quite a fan of physical cash. Physical cash has got a very good level of privacy. No one can know what you do with a $10 note, a €10 note. And it's got a very low level of government control. Very, very few people can tell you what to do with a £10 note, a €10 note, a $10 note once it's in your pocket. Governments obviously don't like that, and I'm not the first person to say this, that if we invented cash today, it would probably be banned immediately. And privacy and government control are two things that are very, very important to think about when we're moving towards a more digital currency. If our currency is entirely digital, it's very easy for governments to surveil and to monitor what we do, and it's very easy for them to control it as well. So the key risk that I want to highlight in this presentation is the fact that a shift to a central bank digital currency, if it's done in the way that we think is likely to happen, will result in both a loss of privacy and an increase of government control. Small anecdote, the reason there's a Facebook logo up on the screen is because, like most of the worst things in the world, the government's and central banks' current interest in CBDCs started at Facebook. I don't know if you remember, in 2018, Facebook tried to create a stablecoin, which was called DM, or Libra. And that, prior to that, actually, most central banks had no interest whatsoever in Bitcoin. They wrote it off as an irrelevance. An investment with, as we heard earlier, no intrinsic value, their favorite phrase. But when Facebook came out with a gigantic pre-built user base, that got central banks absolutely terrified. And as a result, we see the 120 odd countries around the world all eagerly trying to create one so that they can surveil and control us. So this is one of my favorite chaps. So I thought whenever we're talking about these things, I think it's always useful to hear what their proponents say rather than their opponents. So we've got a couple of clips interspersed in the presentation today. This man is Augustin Carstens. As you can see, he's clearly a well-fed man, which is good. And he's a big fan of CBDCs now. And we'll listen to.
We tend to establish the equivalence with cash, and there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability.
Well, he got a bit distracted looking down, I suppose, at his next meal there. But the, I'm a horrible person, sorry. I mean, the most important thing, I think, is what he said there at the end. The central bank will have absolute control over the use of that expression of central bank liability. And I think it's always important, when someone tells you who they are, you need to believe them. The BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, if you don't already know, is effectively the central bank of central banks. In the same way that a central bank within a nation state operates as a settlement institution for all of the different banks within that nation state, the Bank of International Settlements performs the same function for all central banks worldwide. So they have an incredibly important and integral function within the worldwide banking system. And for the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements to say quite openly and unashamedly that their aim is to know who's using that $100 bill, if it's in digital form, and to have absolute control over how it is used, I think it's very important for all of us as citizens in, hopefully free and democratic countries to ask, is that exactly how you want to live your life and how you want your money to be treated? You get up every day, you go to work, you work hard for your money, you come home, you get paid at the end of the month, and then you find that a third party has got control over your funds and can determine how you spend them and how you use them. It's not the kind of world that I want to live in, and I hope it's not the kind of world that you want to live in either. So we've already touched on a few of these issues here, but I just want to break out a few of them while we have them on the slide. So surveillance and control, we already know is a key issue with these, and we've elaborated a little bit under column 1 there, a few of the things that we might be able to, that governments might be able to enforce if these things come into play. A key one really that I wanted to focus on, quite a simple example, that CBDCs effectively allow punishment before proof. So it's a key tenet of most liberal democracies that if I've committed a crime, the government then needs to prove that in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt. Using an example as simple as a parking fine, if all of your money is in the form of a CBDC and your local council decides that you have parked illegally, they will be able to debit that money from your CBDC account instantly. Very simple. And then subsequently you'll have to contest that. At the moment, you get a ticket. And then you can appeal that ticket before the money has actually left your account. And if you're at all like me, I've appealed a number of tickets and they've said, oh, actually, you did park legally, don't worry about it at all. If we invert the presumption of innocence, that I think is a very, very dangerous step for any society to take. And as with all of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, this is something that can inevitably snowball. Today may be fine, you may live in a liberal democracy. But as we know, in Europe, our history over the last 150, 200 years has shown that liberal democracies are not immune to collapse and to increasing levels of authoritarian control. It's just an unfortunate fact of human history. If you put a rule in today that is fine, there's no guarantee that it will be fine tomorrow. So we should be very careful about the rules and systems and structures that we create. Erosion of privacy, a fairly obvious one. I don't need to enumerate for you the vast numbers of different data leaks that seem to occur on an almost daily basis. The biggest one I saw recently was, I think, Ticketmaster, which incredibly leaked the details of 500 million people. I mean, it's worth stopping and thinking about that for a second. That's more than the population of the United States. It's 0.5 billion people's detail is now available for sale on the dark web. That happened just a few days ago. And given the fact that governments can't do IT, I'm almost certain that if we have a CBDC system, there will be catastrophic leaks of personal data. Coercion and censorship, I think this is quite worrying, and this is something where very often you sound like a bit of a conspiracy theorist when you say this happened. But again, an example from a liberal democracy in the form of Canada. You're probably all aware of the Canadian truckers' protest, where we had, in a liberal democracy, a protest that may not have been to the taste of the government, but was nevertheless legal. Not only were the bank accounts of the protesters themselves frozen, the bank accounts of people who donated to those protesters were frozen. So again, think about this for a moment. If you make a political donation to an opposition party, and the party in power decides that they don't want that opposition party to have funds, very, very easy for them to switch off your money. And I'm afraid that switching off money is it's a prime weapon in the authoritarian's toolkit. There's a playbook that authoritarians tend to follow whenever they come to power. They attack the courts, they attack the free press, and they attack your ability to transact freely. If they can shut down your money, that can shut you down as well, very, very easily. So we have another of my friends. This one is Aswar Prasad. He is at the IMF, and he has some interesting things to say about programmability, which would enable
It's not just about digital forms of physical currency. You can have programmability, units of central bank currency with expiry dates. You could have, as I argue in my book, a potentially better and some people might see it as a darker world where the government decides that units of central bank money can be used to purchase some things, but not other things that it deems less desirable.
Right. I find that extraordinarily concerning, particularly his weird little smile when he's telling us these horrible things. You could have units of central bank money that can be used to purchase some things, but not other things. Segueing slightly into a conceptual consideration of what money is, for me that really undermines the whole idea of money is fungible. One unit of money should be indistinguishable from any other unit of money. He's describing a world where the government may have designated food money and water money, and you wouldn't be able to use your water money to buy food. Again, this is not the kind of world that we want to acquiesce to. So obviously, a lot of the things I've said so far don't sound too good about central bank digital currencies, and as a result, governments are beginning to come up with different ways of persuading us that they are a good idea, actually. And financial inclusion is another one of those. Financial inclusion, I think, is one of the buzzwords that people will often use, like everyone wants to look after their children. Everyone wants clean water and clean air. Everyone wants financial inclusion. And look, we've got 1.7 billion people around the world who don't have bank accounts, who can't access the financial system. Wouldn't it be great if they all had bank accounts as well? Unfortunately, as soon as you start digging into exactly how these systems work, you realize that this is at best mistaken and at worst an outright falsehood. The main reason that most people don't have bank accounts is because they don't have ID and they don't have a fixed address. Every single CBDC system that we're looking at the moment seems to require the provision either of your ID or of your address. And to give you an example of one of the most well-advanced ones, the e-Naira, which is the currency in Nigeria, the digital currency that they've been pushing very, very hard for people to adopt. There are different tiers of access that you get in the e-Naira wallet. The most basic one requires your phone number to be submitted, but if you only give your phone number, you can't really use any meaningful amount of money. So they limit your access and they limit the functionality of the money in that wallet. If you provide the most KYC that you possibly can, then finally the money becomes useful. And again, tracking back to what I just said about the fungibility of money, this is an extraordinary idea. You're effectively trading the functionality of the money that the government gives you by paying with your own KYC details, which again, as we know, because governments can't do IT, they will almost certainly leak. Oh, I like this one. So this chap also worked for the IMF alongside Aswar Prasad. He's very excited about limiting the kind of people that can have money and what you can spend it on.
The way we think CBDC can improve financial inclusion is through what we call programmability. That is, CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contract, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized. For example, for food.
So again, CBDCs can be precisely targeted as to what kind of people can use them and to what you can use it for. Again, I wish I was making this up. None of the people whose clips I've played you are opponents of CBDCs. They are all proponents of them. They support the idea. And I think it's very, very important to listen very seriously to what these people are saying about the systems that they're designing. So on the subject of systems, very briefly, there are a couple of ways of creating this. A token versus account. The account model would be more similar to our modern bank accounts. And that would be a centralized system with likely some form of a spreadsheet in much the same way as a modern bank account works. Now, as we know at the moment, governments and central banks are absolutely obsessed with blockchain, but not in the way that we understand it. As you'll remember if you caught Alan Farrington's talk earlier, the only good use that we've discovered for a blockchain is the creation of a non-state digital money, which is decentralized and distributed, and is very, very hard to edit. As we know, if you want to add new transactions to the Bitcoin blockchain, an enormous cost, both in hardware and in energy, is imposed on you. A centralized blockchain, as we know, is largely pointless. The ability of a central bank to amend the ledger, to change the sequence of transactions, even to freeze them, is effectively costless. So we think it is most likely that we will end up with a centralized blockchain run by the central bank, potentially on a token model. There are token models that I would have less problem with. For example, if you're familiar with the concept of Xiaomi and eCash, that is a tokenized model which enables reasonably good privacy and reasonably good transaction speed and transaction finality as well. For this reason, though, I think it's pretty unlikely that central banks will adopt a Xiaomi and eCash model. So it's far more likely to be run on a centralized blockchain, which can be easily amended and controlled using some form of a token system, again, controlled and run by the central banks. And again, because this doesn't sound particularly attractive, we're going to see a lot of adoption incentives. One, again, to mention Nigeria. In Nigeria, they were offering discounts for payment with CBDCs in taxi rides. In Thailand, during their CBDC trial, the government airdropped certain digital baht to various participants in the trial with a couple of interesting conditions. Those Thai baht could only be spent within a certain geographic location and only within a certain time. They had an expiry date on them. And again, coming back to the fungibility point around money, the idea that you could have money in your bank account which could expire within 6 weeks is pretty extraordinary when you begin to think about it, particularly if you had to work for the preceding 6 weeks in order to earn it. But we're going to see more and more of these kind of incentives as we go forward. And as we've seen in China, the People's Republic of China, those are likely to be integrated with your social credit system, and there will be various different incentives. I've already mentioned the cheaper taxi fares. It's likely that you will be able to get better deals on things like insurance products, or airfares, or railway tickets. And the idea behind this flywheel is to create a feedback loop, such as they gradually eliminate cash, they push people further and further towards the CBDC. And perhaps the last example from Nigeria, I've got nothing against Nigeria. I grew up in Southern Africa myself, so they seem to have done a lot of these trial systems ahead of a lot of the rest of the world. They tried to eliminate cash as much as humanly possible. Firstly via what they called a redesignation or a redesign of the currency, and then by forcible elimination of cash from cash machines, which, given that Nigeria is predominantly a cash system at the time, caused a huge amount of distress in the country. And they did that partly because the adoption of their CBDC had been very low, about 0.2% at the time. After they had forced everyone into using the CBDC, adoption moved up to about 6%, and they declared this a massive success, and that the CBDC was now the currency of choice, which is an interesting choice of words if you force people to use it. But no, this is why I don't work for a central bank. So what can we actually do about this to try and end on a sort of more positive note? Both Daniel earlier this morning and I mentioned earlier that commercial banks actually derive a lot of benefit from their ability to create money. And I've stuck up on the slide a few risks that commercial banks might face if they stop being able to issue the digital money that currently circulates within our system. People may pull their money out. Banks may have less lending business. There may be higher borrowing costs if, for example, one of the incentives for adopting a CBDC is that you can borrow from the central bank at a lower rate. So we think at our organization there's potential alliance to be made here with various commercial banks who will push back against CBDCs. And what can we do as individuals, as people? I've split this into protest and prepare. Protest is something we can do right now. Politically, there is a lot of pushback across the world against these things, and I personally find that relatively encouraging. Where we're seeing the most pushback at the moment is actually in the United States. Fortunately, there are a lot of very motivated senators and representatives there who are pushing through bills right at the moment. Tom Emmer, I recommend you follow him on Twitter. He's very good on this subject. He has recently pushed through a bill. It's called the Anti-CBDC Surveillance Bill. That's now been passed by the House of Representatives, and that effectively forbids the Fed ever from creating a CBDC. In the UK, one of Rishi Sunak's recent policies was to allow the ability for the government to monitor absolutely everyone's bank accounts at all times with extraordinary ease, much more easily than they currently do. Ostensibly, they were doing that in order to monitor welfare payments. But the bill as drafted would have allowed them eventually to expand that surveillance out to everyone's bank accounts. That has also been pulled. Parliament's now dissolved. That will not be passed, at least not in the previous Parliament. Legally, there are a few things we can do as well. Augustine Carson's, our fat friend from the first clip, he has expressed a considerable distress with the fact that most countries' laws don't currently allow them to create CBDCs. Personally, I think that's a good thing. Augustine and I are not on the same page, although there probably wouldn't be room for us both at the same time. So in order for us to create a CBDC in the UK, whose policies I know best, we would need to pass an act of parliament. And the more political pressure that we in the UK can put on our MPs and our representatives, the greater chance we have of making it an electoral risk for them to adopt them. I've mentioned the Human Rights Act, the ECHR on the slide. There are two articles that I think are quite interesting there. One is Article 8, and that's the right to privacy, which is arguably substantially harmed by most countries' CBDC plans. And the other is Article 10, which is the right to freedom of expression. And if you read Article 10 in detail, it actually refers to the transmission of information. And I don't think this has been tested yet legally, but there's an interesting line of thought there that the transmission of a Bitcoin transaction is effectively no more than the transmission of information, the broadcast of a transaction to the network. So I think there's an interesting point there to be made around whether or not the transmission of a Bitcoin transaction would fall under Article 10, and potentially other forms of monetary transmission as well. And then personally, something as simple as writing to your representative. We have with Big Brother Watch in the UK, organise a number of different campaigns and pushbacks, contribute to consultations. Banks put out these consultations all the time. There was one recently in the UK, the Bank of England asking, what do you think about our CBDC plans? A group of different organisations got together in the UK, and we managed to get more than 50,000 responses, potentially about 500,000 pages of data into the Bank of England. And then on personal preparation, I think all you really need to think about is the top question there. How can you continue to transact freely if you're under constant surveillance and the government can freeze your money at any time? So we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Bitcoin is nothing more than a monetary tool, but it is a monetary tool that allows you to continue transacting freely in a way that a CBDC does not. And I always come back to the idea that transactional freedom is really a fundamental and foundational freedom for a lot of others. There's no point in having freedom of speech if I shoot my mouth off and then I find that my bank account is frozen. Or there's no point in having freedom of association if I attend a political rally and then I find that the party in power has also managed to freeze my bank account and I can't feed my children or pay rent. So as we mentioned before, in terms of financial repression, if you can throttle someone's means of buying food, water, feeding their children, it's a very simple way and a very cost-effective way of controlling them. And the idea I return to again and again here is that CBDCs dramatically decreased the cost of government enforcement of what they want to do. Earlier in one of the panels, someone was talking about Executive Order 6102. One point that I would have added to what the discussion raised was that the cost of enforcement of 6102 is actually extraordinarily high. It would have involved the government paying people to go house to house to find people's gold, which is why, as Daniel said, you go for the low-hanging fruit. You go for the big custodians first. The cost of enforcement of confiscating Bitcoin from someone is extraordinarily high and unlikely to be paid by any government. Cost of enforcing CBDC confiscation, virtually nothing. So in terms of what we can do, I appreciate I'm running out of time, I'll be brief. Learn as much as you can about censorship-resistant money and prepare for a world in which people might be wanting to restrict your freedom to transact, because I'd like you all to maintain that. Bit of extra reading if anyone's interested. So the Cato Institute have done great work on CBDCs. They've got lots of papers on their website. I strongly recommend them. The Human Rights Foundation CBDC tracker is a fantastic piece of work. It's interactive. You can click on a country, you can spin the globe around and see what their plans are looking like, how far they've got down the line, and whether it's been a success or not. The good news is that none of them have been a success before, and long may that continue. And then our own website there, we have all of our papers in our research section there. And so to end on a bit of a whimsical note, I'm sure everyone has either heard of or watched The Lord of the Rings. We're in a very bizarre situation as regards our central bank money at the moment. You remember I said at the beginning, I'm quite a fan of cash. I like its good privacy protection. I like its strong censorship resistance. If you remember from the film, Gandalf wouldn't even touch the ring because he knew it was so dangerous and so powerful that it would corrupt a being even as virtuous as himself. We're now in an extraordinarily weird situation where central banks are saying, let's use the ring, but just for a little bit, and only for good purposes, and everything will be fine. Well, if you've seen The Lord of the Rings, you will know that absolutely would not have happened. So I'd encourage central banks to do the right thing, send these things into Mount Doom where they belong, and leave us free to use our Bitcoin as we see fit. And that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.